Hi everyone, welcome to this week's Managers Q&A on neurodivergence at work and how neurodivergence can show up in workplace settings. I'm here most Tuesdays, not every single Tuesday, but most Tuesdays at 1:30 p.m. UK time to answer your questions about neurodivergence. So please feel free to stick your questions into the chat using the comments on LinkedIn. This is a LinkedIn live session. And just to introduce myself to you, those of you who are not familiar with me, my name's Kate Esiche, and I'm an internal communications consultant by trade, 20 years corporate communications consultant, but also a neuro inclusion consultant. So I now coach managers. I'm an executive coach, and I coach managers and organizations, leaders to understand neurodivergence at work and how it presents or how it can present, because every neurodivergent individual is an individual, and therefore the presentations will be different. But there are many commonalities that you can identify. And I usually come on LinkedIn live every Tuesday, most Tuesdays at 1:30 p.m. just for a quick Q&A, 15 minutes for anyone who wants to ask a question about neurodivergence at work and neuroinclusion. And neuroinclusion is basically the practice that organizations, managers, leaders can adopt to managing their teams and to creating a culture and behaviors and values to support neurodivergent employees and, in fact, to support everyone, but more importantly, specifically neurodivergent employees. So, neurodivergence relates to neurotypes like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia. There are quite a few different neurotypes that come under the umbrella of neurodivergence. And it's always really interesting to have conversations with different people on this topic, because wherever you go, you will see a similar challenges that surface. And I wanted to focus specifically today on behaviors, particularly communication behaviors and interactions are focused on verbal communication specifically. So much of what we do and say every day in organizations, in teams, in collaborative spaces is centered on verbal communication, non-verbal communication too, body language, etc. But also mainly verbal communication. What we say is so important. Words are important. And for many neurotypical people, people who are not neurodivergent, who are not autistic, who don't have ADHD or dyslexia or dyspraxia or multiple diagnosis, because it's very common to have more than one. Um, Words mean a lot. So what we hear is so important to us, and we take a lot from that. We conclude a lot from that. And we use it to guide us as to the intentions of the individuals who's speaking. But for many neurotypical people, words are words, and they offer neurodivergent people, sorry, and particularly autistic people, words are words, and they offer a means to an end. Um, as is the case for neurotypical people, words serve a purpose, such as please open the door for me, or please grab that spoon for me, or please pick up that piece of rubbish. You want your words to result in an action. And that's common sense, you would think. But for many neurodivergent people, words are very simply words, and the way that they're said is not necessarily unimportant, but does not come naturally to a neurodivergent person. Like an autistic person will say what they mean, um, and mean what they say. They will literally ask for what they want without any additional um, camouflaging or scaffolding or framework to make it more palatable, to make it easier to consume. And that even as I'm saying it sounds very odd, because if you say to someone, pick up that that piece of rubbish, that could be appropriate. For example, in a school, a child drops an empty packet, crisp packet on the floor, and the teacher says, pick up that crisp packet. There's a hierarchy reason for the abruptness of the teacher's command, number one. Number two, the child has committed a mild offence in that they've dropped some litter on the ground, knowing fully well that they shouldn't, and that they should use the bins that are available. And this is a very, very basic example because it's easy to understand. And the child will therefore, number one, accept the command because of the hierarchical difference. It's a teacher, there's a power balance, imbalance. They are in charge. You are a child, you're not in charge. Obviously, there'll be an age difference too. You know, the teacher is older, presumably. The child is younger, not always the case. For example, at university, you get adult students, but even there, you know, there's a power imbalance because the tutor's in charge of the lessons. And so, therefore, it's somehow acceptable for that language to be quite direct. Whereas if you're in a peer to peer relationship, in an organizational setting, or even if you're in a manager employee team member relationship, and someone says to a peer, you didn't do this correctly, or this is wrong, there needs to be some, not always. I mean, the other person could well be in favor of direct communication, but often that wouldn't be the case. So many people need that supporting framework, that camouflaging or that scaffolding to make the conversation, to make that direct piece of communication, that literal instruction or feedback quite easy to consume. So if someone were to say to you, you did that wrong, with absolutely nothing else around it, you may well think, right, I know I did that wrong, but A, why are you saying it like that? Number one. Number two, who do you think you are? Because you're a peer. And number three, couldn't you have said it in a nicer way or in a way that would make it easier for me to accept? And all of that can sound really odd to an autistic person in particular. They may well think the literality serves a purpose, which it does. So why the need for additional frameworking, additional camouflaging, additional scaffolding? But in the neurotypical world, in the non-neurodivergent world, we are so used to having verbal communication created in such a way as to make it acceptable for the person on the receiving end. And of course, this is also cultural. So, depending on where you sit in the world, the directness is sometimes perceived in a positive way, perceived in a negative way. And in the UK, where I live, we don't necessarily speak very directly. We do a lot of camouflaging, a lot of scaffolding, a lot of frameworking in order to make conversations, difficult conversations, easy conversations, feedback conversations, to make them much more palatable. Whereas a country like Germany, directness is favoured and in fact it's welcomed. But of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can be rude, but it's the perception that counts. So in the UK, if you don't provide that framework around a piece of negative feedback, for example, you did that wrong, you know, that wasn't right, you would expect that to be preceded by, well, hi, Kate, how's it going? You know, I noticed that this piece of work seems a bit off, or I noticed that you neglected to, I noticed that you forgot to, I noticed that this was missing. What do you think? And so, therefore, what you've done is A, you've addressed me as an individual, and you've come to me with some level of doubt around what could be wrong or what could be missing. You're not sure. And on another level, you're asking me for support to decipher whether I've actually got that right. So it makes the person who's on the receiving end, in other words, me, feel much more comfortable to address that negative feedback. It's still the same thing. They're telling me the same thing. They've noticed that I've done something wrong, but they're framing it in a way as to make it more acceptable for me. There's pride in that. There's a fear of embarrassment, a fear of shame. There's some level of, I suppose, self-preservation there too. And in organizational settings, we all know that politics, self-preservation plays a huge role in organizational settings and in professional people's lives, particularly in a workplace setting, in a workplace environment. So all of those things are really important in order to make the collaboration fruitful. And this is the challenge that I see a lot in managers and teams, organizations where that is not understood. It is automatically assumed to be a problem around communication, ability, communication, um, understanding, stakeholder management. What do those things mean in reality? And they mean something like what I've just outlined, which is to be able to address each individual with their perception around what is acceptable with verbal communication and what isn't in mind. So often you will come across people in any cultural setting who will be more than happy to have a direct conversation, who don't mind that literal language. And I've worked with people who are very direct and quite abrupt, and I've learned that they are very direct and they're quite abrupt, and often that that level of communication pertains to leadership. You will get leaders who are deliberately direct and abrupt, and perhaps not. Maybe there could be some neurodivergence at play, but it's still perceived as more acceptable because of the position. But if you've got a junior member of the team, or you have a team member who works under a manager, an individual contributor, someone who doesn't have a team for themselves, then depending on the organizational culture, because it could be a flat approach to hierarchy, there's still some need to be able to frame verbal communication in a way that makes it more palatable for the recipient. And that all comes down to perception. It all comes down to the recipient's expectations around communication. What's acceptable, what is seen what is seen as acceptable to the individual who is, being spoken to. What do they think about communication? Do you know what their perceptions are about communication, verbal communication in particular? Do they have a need for directness? Have you tried to be direct with them, or have you tried to camouflage the communication in a way that makes it much more framed and palatable? And has that been met with some level of frustration? I know from having conversations in my 20 years experience in organizations with senior leaders, some do not like the fluff. They don't want the hi, how are you? How's your weekend? How are things going? I noticed this, or have you got a second? They just want you to go in and, like, I've got 5 minutes, just ask me what you want to ask me. Oh, can you look at this? I'm a bit worried about that. What do you think about this? And there's no need. And the same goes for individual contributors. But for many people, particularly in countries like the UK, there's some need for framing before you go into the actual request. And for many autistic people, that is a challenge. It's not something that comes naturally. I think it's learned over the years, even for neurotypical people. So it's something that they have observed as they've been growing up. They've seen their parents speak like that. They've seen siblings speak like that. They've seen some level of verbal communication, which is framed with the pleases, with Could you is that with the would you mind, those kind of language, is really key, particularly in the UK, and the US too. I think that sort of approach to communication is really rewarded. But for many neurodivergent people, that level of camouflaging, that frameworking is unnecessary, and they find it very difficult to understand why that frameworking is necessary to get a message across. So it's a conversation I have quite a lot, and it's really fascinating when you talk to people, neurodivergent and neurotypical, about it, because there's an observation always that this is at play. But where's it written down? Where have you seen it documented? Is it on posters? Is it written in a kind of a guidance sheet? No, it isn't. We talk about culture, we talk about values, we talk about employer brands, all of these wonderful things. But how often do we talk? We talk about internal narrative even, but how often do we talk about the unspoken rules of verbal communication? And that's why I wanted to offer it up as a topic today to get the conversation going. If you're watching this on playback, feel free to DM me or email me at wheretolookcomms.co.uk, and I'd be more than happy to continue the conversation there, or on LinkedIn via DM. You can visit my website at wheretolookcomms.co.uk, find out more about my coaching and my training program. And yeah, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to connect with me and ask, particularly about communication, because it's such an important facet of the differences between neurotypical and neurodivergent people. And I'd say it was the foundation of neuro inclusion. If you want to take a neuro inclusive approach to management and leading a team, then communication is key. So thank you so much for watching on playback, or if you're watching live and you haven't had a chance to ask a question, you're always welcome here. And I'll be back online, touch wood, next Tuesday. I always post it in advance, so keep an eye out for that. Thanks for joining. Thanks for watching.